Welcome back. I'm Hugh Burroughs. We're talking with Judge John Noonan. Judge Noonan of Boston extraction, been a Bay Area resident for many years at Bolt Hall. One of the interesting things, he was appointed by President Reagan to the court in 1986, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and he has a continuing interest in Christianity, particularly in his own Catholic background. We're discussing with him his new book by the University of Notre Dame Press, A Church That Can and Cannot Change. You, when we went to break, you had cited Scripture, the teachings of Christ, on some things that cannot change, and the book is 4 illustrative things of how things do change. You said at the break you might want to suggest we pick up with marriage and go from there.
Why don't I do that, plunge into marriage, because it's an area where there are changes in process, and you can see it visibly. And it's in the area, it's a very curious area, you might say. It's the area of how the church regards the marriages of persons who are not baptized, persons who are therefore outside the Christian community. And the church has come to accept, at least in some cases, divorce for the unbaptized. Now that is quite astonishing if you take it that the general teaching of the theologians is that by natural law marriage is indissoluble. But going back to a teaching of St. Paul in his letter to the first letter to the Corinthians, there has been a development of doctrine that permits the church not only to accept divorce, but to perform divorces for unbaptized persons whose marriages in some way interact with the marriages of Christians. And I think that is a very striking development. These marriages that are dissolved by the church, where there is really, the word is divorce, it should be used, the church uses the word dissolve, but it's the same thing. They amount to thousands of divorces pronounced not by secular authority, but by the church on behalf of Catholics who want to be married to someone who is already in an existing marriage with an unbaptized person. And that is a phenomenon of the last 80 years. It's something that came into existence with the 1918 Code of Canon Law, has picked up speed in the last 50 years, so that there are thousands of these divorce cases going to Rome. And that's not the Roman rota, which people think of as a possible way of ending a marriage. No, this is an administrative action granting divorce to the unbaptized.
And this is important because it illustrates in your book, if I understand your premise, that change isn't really blueprinted. it sort of occurs.
That's right. There is no blueprint I can see. It is just a response based on experience and empathy of people who see current problems. And sometimes the change occurs through the leadership of the church. Sometimes it occurs through the membership of the church. It's not a necessarily top to bottom thing. It can work the other way. But in the particular case of the development on marriage, it's been the work of people trained in canon law, finding a rather large area in which it is permissible, according to Catholic teaching, to dissolve an existing valid marriage in order to promote the spiritual welfare of someone who wants to contract a new marriage with a Catholic.
You might say that part of this canon law in the 2,000-year-old history of the Catholic Church, and sometimes it sort of gets hoisted on its own petard of maybe from your field, stare decisis. Once things have been done for so many centuries one way, there has to be, someone has to find a way to change that.
There's a heavy weight given to precedent, but precedent is in the end not decisive.
Let's talk then about slavery, one of the 4 topics of your book, A Church That Can and Cannot Change.
Well, slavery is another type of example I think the overwhelming fact is that this practice of holding other human beings and treating them as property, selling them as property, was perfectly acceptable to all kinds of people who thought of themselves as good Christians. And the first formal and complete condemnation of it within the Catholic Church occurred in 1965 at the Second Vatican Council. That's rather late. And I think it would be fair to say that most Catholics had decided it was wrong maybe 100 years earlier. But it was only in 1965 that the official magisterium of the church said it was wrong. So that's a good example of change moving from the bottom to the top.
Usury.
Usury was a case where the people in the field, the bankers, successfully lobbied and finally persuaded the theologians that their practices is charging a moderate interest, as they said, 5%. That couldn't be bad. You needed some interest to stimulate commerce, so that in a long battle that went on, I would say, from 1500 to 1700, the people in the field persuaded the theologians that what they were doing was acceptable and that banking at a moderate rate of interest was okay.
Now, we've touched lightly on three then, on marriage, on slavery, and on lending laws. How did you select these three? We have the religious freedom laws example yet to go.
Well, I suppose I went back to lending since I'd started with that, and slavery because it just bowled me over that there'd been such a huge change. And then marriage, I've written a separate book on that, and I had seen that this development was in the process, and it's now become even more obvious that change is occurring here, that this is not a closed area, but it's, I would say it was an active area of change where people in the field are thinking more and more about the implications that the church has power to dissolve marriages for the spiritual welfare of people who want to receive the sacraments.
We're talking with John Noonan about his new book, A Church That Can and Cannot Change, examples of what looks to be sort of an unchangeable thing, but in fact, he's saying change bubbles up from all sorts of ways. Stay with us. We'll continue our conversation with Judge Noonan when we come back.